with a Swiss Army knife like that. So when you kind of think about prioritization, it's really like people introduce like frameworks and things like that to help make decision better. Like, so this is more like a cost-benefit kind of framework, where you kind of think about whether this feature is worth it, whether it's high reward and it's high effort, whether it's like commonly used or less commonly used. So this is kind of like one of the frameworks that you can think about, or you can kind of angle your decisions on. And it might help you frame your decision a little bit better. How many of you like sort of use a framework like that to make decisions over here? Nobody? Not even the product managers? Okay. So if I may ask, like for the product managers working in the room, does anyone want to like share like how they kind of like do prioritization? Okay. No? All right. I'll move on then. So I think a lot of people, or some people might face this issue whereby your client comes to you, or your business owner comes to you, or your boss comes to you and say, hey, can we like just slot in this little feature or this small little change and try and, yeah, it's just gonna like take 2 hours of the team's time, I think. Like maybe they tell you like, it's gonna take a day, it's not gonna like cost you much. But people don't really think deep enough, and it's our job as a product manager to really ask the tough questions. So when someone says like, yeah, it's a small feature, it's just like a small change, but overall like a small change can really impact and kind of affect the overall product piece. And this is like a real slide I had to show a business stakeholder, just to like walk my business stakeholder through like the kind of thought and the level of detail a product manager needs to think about. And this is just like only high level stuff. Like if we go into more technical depth, if we go into like thinking about back end and front end and how they integrate and how the feature actually affects all the other moving parts, it's even a longer list of questions. So when people say, oh, I want this new feature, they don't really think about all these things. We as product managers need to think about all of these things. Like, does it really help with the business? Is it like a feature that's really worth implementing? What's the business goal over here? And can the business support it? Like someone tried to ask us to build like a form with like where you can make appointments and things like that. And I had to ask like, oh, did the operations team say they can support this? Like, can they actually service the client when they actually make an appointment on the website and things like that? So sometimes our clients and our business owners or our bosses don't think through, and it's our responsibility to kind of raise all of these issues to them and even like walk them through and say like, you know, these are the number of questions that I'm thinking about. You know, what's your thought on this? And if you kind of introduce them to like, oh, actually I didn't think like this actually impacts another part of the website. Oh, actually another part of the website has the same content. Maybe we just need to kind of like make the navigation a little bit better instead of like building this new page. So I think as a product owner, you need to be quite inquisitive and be quite relentless in diving deep. So this is one of my favorite quotes from a strategy book. It's good strategy, bad strategy. You guys can like YouTube it. It's like a really good 1.5 hour talk by this guy called Richard Rumelt. And Richard says like, a hallmark of true expertise and insight is making a complex subject understandable. Hallmark of mediocrity and bad strategy is unnecessary complexity, a lot of fluff, and that actually leads to failure. And I don't think this is like foreign to many of you. I mean, At some point in your life, you must have thought your boss was an idiot. At some point in your life, you must have thought, hey, how come the management have like no idea about like where they need to go, what they need to do? They are like asking us to do like so many things, and they don't have like a clear metric for success or a clear direction. I think this is not foreign to many people. So for me, if I kind of like edit the code a little bit, I think a bad strategy is pretty much like that, right? So you think about it, as a product manager, you need to prioritize like a long list of requirements, and a mediocre or a bad product is where you have unnecessary stuff and a lot of fluff inside. So it's very related to strategy. If you can see a bad strategy and a bad product quite easily. And a bad strategy isn't an absence of strategy. It's just like not having very clear focus and not knowing what's the goal and what you need to do to get there. So there's always this kind of like eternal debate about whether as a product manager I should use data to make my decisions on the features, or whether I should use my intuition in terms of like design thinking and things like that. So can I just get a few of the room? How many of you use like your intuition to make decisions? Great stuff. Like product decisions, I mean. And any of you are like super focused on like data? Like you need someone to prove to you, like show me the data before you make a decision. Awesome. How many of you kind of like use both? Okay. I think as a good product manager, you should kind of like use both. But it's also important to build your product sense, as we call it, like your product intuition. And one of the ways to really do that is to be really passionate about your product, number one, and to always constantly look out for new products, like what's kind of like best in class, like, oh, what is Uber doing, what's Airbnb doing, you know, and just like play around a bit and kind of like do a breakdown, like, oh, why did they like implement this new feature? Why did they rearrange the button this way? Oh, why did LinkedIn like remove this feature or something like that? And kind of like ask yourself why, and go through this sort of mental exercise. And the more often you do that, and the more you practice with that, it helps you think on sort of like a deeper level, and you kind of find that over the months you build up this like intuition. I come from a background where I do design, and I remember like when I was in design school, the lecturer would ask us to submit an assignment like 2 weeks early before the assignment date. And whenever I submit an assignment, and they would like actually say like, this is really bad, you need to think about this X, Y, and Z. And then I'll go back and I'll redo my assignment, and then I'll submit it again. And as long as it hasn't hit like the deadline, the lecturer will actually keep asking me to redo my assignment. And I didn't really understand why at that point in time, why my lecturer would be like so sadistic and keep asking me to redo my design assignment. But after like a year, like being in design school, I kind of understand why. And the reason being is that you really need to build up design sense and like product sense. You kind of need to do it through repetition and through that process of like doing it to get to a certain level of standard. So as a product manager, you need to be really passionate about products and look at what good products are doing, and try and, even if you run a startup or whether you kind of do your own product, or if you're not doing a product, like study that and try and get to that level and try and get to that level of thinking. And I think there are a lot of great content and great blogs out there. So, any one of you heard of this like toothbrush test? So whenever Google acquires a company, they will like do this toothbrush test, right? So the idea of a toothbrush test is that, is this something someone would use once or twice a day, and does it like make your life better? By the way, this is not a real image. I'm pretty sure Larry Page was carrying a microphone and someone just like edited a toothbrush inside. Yeah, it's like Photoshop. But it talks about the point quite succinctly, right? If your product can pass the toothbrush test, you probably have like a really good product. And we do have like a few examples, and quite a few in Singapore. Apps like Carousel, like you're really active in like buying and selling, and yeah. So one other thing to think about is like about features is about how frequently someone uses the feature, and whether someone would adopt, like when you implement a new feature, will it help like increase adoption of your product app? So that's something to really ponder upon. And I think it's really important that as a product manager, you have sort of this frameworks and mentality to help you make the appropriate decisions so that you can say no. And you want to say no, because if you don't, this will happen. Where you actually get your team to build like features and then nobody actually uses it. So as a fellow product manager, and if you're kind of like going into product management, I would always encourage you to ask why. So that's my short little presentation. I kind of want to make it a little bit more interactive. So if any of you are like product managers in this room and you would love to share your experience, please feel free, or you can ask me any questions. Thank you. Anyone? Yeah, hi.
Hi. So I was wondering, when you're sort of starting a new project and doing like a first iteration, you know, like a lot of fidelity mock-up and prototype, what are the features to prioritize?
Right. So I think when you start a new project, you probably have a list of assumptions, right? And when you think about it, you probably feel like, okay, I'm assuming my customer, which you probably may draw personas or not, will want like X, Y, and Z. Or if kind of like you're building for someone you kind of know quite intimately, then you assume like there are certain features that you want to include. So if you're building sort of like a low fidelity wireframe or mockup where you kind of want to, and you have the flexibility in the organization to work in sort of a very lean startup way, if your organization believes that, or if you're a startup and you're running it that way, then you can sort of structure it into tests and build those and kind of test your assumptions and see whether they're correct. It's quite different for, actually I wouldn't say it's quite different, I say it's sort of the same. Basically, if you notice when you build a mobile app, there's always one key action in a mobile app. For Tinder, it's like swiping left and right, right? And you kind of want to think along those lines when you build your low fidelity mockup, when you want to test that assumption. What's sort of like that key action that you sort of want to get your user to use, and whether they're like, oh, when you're testing, and whether are they actually looking for something else. So if you kind of have that discipline and you think along that lines, it'll sort of help to structure your decisions. Does that help? Okay. Hi.
Hi, I'm Suya. I want to know, like, in terms of prioritization, so we have all those products backlog lining up, everything right growing.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, once you build something out of MVP and then keep adding up more features and features,
Yeah.
at some point you end up like bunch of technical debt.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
your product backlog start to have things like do something with RepMP.
Yeah.
Do something with MongoDB. I don't know what it is, but guys say it's important. And as a product manager, how do you manage? How other people manage?
Okay, there are like many many ways to frame that problem, and I'll just explain for the benefit of people who don't know those terms that she mentioned. MVP is like minimum viable product. It's basically like the prototype where you kind of, or the first version that you release it to the market and get users to use, where it kind of fits like, or rather you're testing for product market fit. And she talked about backlog. Backlog is like it's like a collection of like ideas where you park, where it was not in your MVP, or it kind of like is this long list of requests and features and wants. And as a product manager, you're supposed to do some housekeeping on that list and make sure like the things that are inside this list are actually things that needs to be built. So one of the dangers of having a long list of unwanted items is that sometimes people see like your team, you're kind of idle, and they say like, hey, you guys are not doing anything. So why not we like start building feature 1, feature 2, feature 3 and stuff like that. And that's really, really dangerous, because when that happens, you're like building things that are unnecessary. And if you think about it, from sort of a staffing point of view, as your product goes from MVP stage to like future release versions, you kind of want to take into consideration technical debt, as you mentioned correctly, and that you also want to take into consideration that to maintain a product that grows a lot, you probably need to kind of increase the capacity of your engineering capacity, say like 20%, as you kind of maintain the products over the years. So that's the engineering and staffing consideration. In terms of prioritization, it really goes back to like asking the business tough questions and really checking with the market, like, do they really need those features? Is it really in use, or does your entire product need like a totally different product strategy because you guys haven't found product market fit as a startup or as a business? So yeah, sometimes you just have to go back to the drawing board. And in cases where you don't, then it's just like being a product manager, being very close to your customers, constantly like having your team interview customers or have like some FaceTime with your customers will really keep them in check. The last thing you want to do is like build a product and you're sitting in this high tower like building a product like what IT teams used to, and building like a bunch of features that nobody wants, or like a product that's very convoluted. So that's my thought on that. Does anyone have sort of like additional thoughts? Yeah.
I have a thought and a question as well.
Yeah.
So 2 companies I worked at did something called a HIP sprint, which is hardening, innovation, and planning. At the end of your whatever grouping you use, quarter, month, whatever, you dedicate 1 sprint to cleaning out as much technical debt as you possibly can, and make sure that you're in the most successful place to deliver on your next quarter's deliverables. And the way you position it is making sure that we can continue to deliver fast, so that if we don't tackle this, we're going to slow down overall. But at the end of the day, you can't understand everything that's there, so you need to rely on your team.
That's a good thought as well. Yeah, housekeeping. Yeah.
So for me, I want to share my experiences.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so for me, so basically me is a business analyst.
That business analyst,
so
yeah.
I get a business requirement. So
Correct.
I work insurance, investment management myself. So for prioritization, we use a methodology of from Moscow prioritization. So it's must do, should do, could do, and will do. So we differentiate the user needs, wants, and desires.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's a good decision framework. Yeah. So I think like if you could like use decision frameworks to help with your decision, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Do you have something to share?
That's got a question.
Oh, okay.
So you mentioned about data and intuition to
Yeah.
prioritize your decisions.
Yeah.
So more from a startup perspective,
Yeah.
because we have some features to insight which you roll out. So the startup with limited resources, so you can make our decisions hopefully on the mark.
Yeah.
How would you say between intuition, because the company should understand this product very well. Versus say user interviews, you get feedback on which you get more of which you like to have.
Yeah.
What kind of weightage would you
I think I noticed this problem with a lot of startups is that because of the popularity of lean startup, people think that they can pivot their way out of a bad strategy. I think that's really harmful because you're burning cash. Your team is like burning cash, and you're just like working on like tests and assumptions and tests all the way. That's like not a good way to run a startup. And if your startup is in this state, I implore you to like question your management on getting the strategy right. Your product roadmap, or rather like what's your product going to be like and what the features are going to go in, is largely driven by the business strategy and sort of like the market needs as well. So the management needs to sort of have a very clear idea about what's the goal of the business, and what are the few things that we want to focus on to like achieve that goal, and what does the product need to do to achieve that goal. So if I give you an example, and you think about like great strategic minds, people like Jeff Bezos from Amazon. If you look at the shareholder letters of Amazon from like basically the time that they started, Jeff Bezos listed like their entire company's strategy in the shareholder letter, and for them, their business strategy is really clear. It's about being sort of like the cheapest low-cost solution provider for like e-commerce, and keeping that cost so low that they can acquire significant market share. And because they take a long-term view to the business as a whole, having that is advantageous for them. And with that, probably like the early version of Amazon is just focused on like books, and it's just like focusing on like making the delivery a lot smoother and a lot better. And with a very clear business strategy, you kind of have like a really good idea about what should go into that product, and that sort of informs the intuition. But I'm sure Amazon also tests a lot, so they probably also use data to sort of like optimize like their button placements and their headlines and stuff like that. Yeah, does that answer your question? Okay.
So you're mentioning about data, right? So how do you measure the success of a specific feature? Like, is there a way that you use to like measure success of a specific feature?
Yeah. Sorry, do you want to say something?
I'm going to counter that with why would you build a feature unless you know if it works?
Right.
Before you build a feature, you should decide what.
So you build a specific feature, but you want to know like how do you track the specific, like how do you track the success?
You don't build a feature unless you know why it works. Like unless you have a hypothesis for which you build the feature.
Yeah, we kind of know like why we build the feature, but we want to know like there are like ways that we can track the success of the specific feature.
Right.
There's some ways so we like
Yeah, I really. I'm gonna give you a lawyer's answer. It depends. Yeah. So, yeah, my legal team says that a lot. It depends on the feature you sort of want to build, right? And what are you exactly testing? So, if you could give me a more specific example, and I could help you.
Usually, like, because one of the things that we learn is like previously back in the studies, the fact that we ask like stakeholders, which is like how do you track like specific features. So before I start my employment with the next company, I went to find out about how people at the back end track the specific features like that. Then ways of how you track it.
Okay. What does it got to do with metrics?
Like it's a lot to do with like the kind of goals they want, like for example, like specific KPI, like the money and leave downloads. Like other than that, is there other way that you set goals and like analytics or something that you can track?
Yeah, I believe you should track usage for sure. But yeah, that's a very big question. I would implore you to, use your best judgment what you think is like an appropriate metric for that feature that you need to build. So let's see if I can give an example. We all know like monthly downloads are like it's quite a big feature and doesn't really determine the success of a product. A more appropriate metric to determine the success of say a mobile product would be probably like monthly active users, and if we kind of break it down, monthly active users, what is sort of like an engagement ratio, like are they from that people who are active, like how many are using it daily, how many are using it like once and then like dropping out, how many are like just downloading it and not even opening the app. So I think it's kind of and whether that is the right metric or not, you will kind of know when you see it, because that will sort of inform your product decisions, and you kind of know like this is helpful or not. So what you want to do is, in general, if I give a general principle rule of thumb, is to kind of like dive deep. When a business say, oh yeah, we want to have like 100,000 users by in 6 months. And you kind of want to dive deep into what that 100,000 users constitute. Are they like going to be using it daily or and things like that? And it's your kind of your prerogative to kind of challenge the business on that and say like, yeah, we should be thinking about all these things, and this is like the actual metric to look at. We should be looking at engagement. We should be looking at users who are using our app daily, because our most active users will then also be the users who are likely to switch from like a free model to a paying customer. So it's kind of like your job to do that as a product manager. Yeah, sure, man.
You have many dollars, right? So every single app should have like the primary action that you want to use it to perform.
Correct.
Right. So for example, like let's say you're open at a Google hospital, the primary app is for user to book the right. The user is not booking the right.
Yeah.
And the app is available, the download is configured. Right. So from there, this is primary action is achieved. Then your model is correct. Then from there, you can dive in, you want to see who booked more than one.
Yeah.
What time to attack.
Yeah.
So always identify your primary action and then measure that.
Yeah. And that primary action is like linked to the business strategy. That's like no doubt about that.
Can I ask you?
Oh.
So I wasn't in
Okay, sure.
earlier presentation wasn't here.
Sure.
So regarding prioritization,
Yeah.
how much of execution effort influence prioritization?
Sorry, how much does?
Execution effort influence prioritization.
Yeah. Execution effort, definitely. I mean, if I were to go back to the slide, of course, I'm not sure if this slide answers your question, but definitely you want to try to go for like things that doesn't take a lot of effort, but really is important for your users, and it's used like very often, like one of the participants mentioned. So you kind of use these frameworks to kind of help you make better decisions. So if you feel like there's just a lot of moving parts in terms of informing that decision, you kind of need to ask yourself like, oh, is your team overworked? Are there still any important business features, important features that the business really needs? Have that been built already and things like that? So yeah, there's a lot of questions related. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Cool. So I'm saying from actually not mentioned was business manager.
Okay.
So I kind of observed a pattern where brand manager or management feels to always reflect that you need to fully find the work of very good.
Okay.
They will spend across like $400.
Yeah.
They will tend to go it off and try to their work, their freedom rate is like 50.
Yeah.
And you know, you tend to go